Hello and welcome back to the Actor Populi podcast. Today we'll be talking about solely the subject of democracy. With me is Jack Powell.
Hi.
And Thomas Lee.
So, very interesting subject, democracy. I thought I'd start with one of my favourite philosophers, the Genevan philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he, in his seminal book, The Social Contract, talks a lot about democracy. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau inspired Nietzsche and Darwin and so many other people. Anyway, this is the quote, and it's quite relevant. This is made in about the 18th century. The people of England regard itself as free, but it is grossly mistaken. It is free only during the election of members of Parliament. As soon as they are elected, slavery overtakes, and it is nothing. The use it makes of the short movements of liberty it enjoys show, indeed, that it deserves to lose them. So that's quite poignant, isn't it? Because it feels like today in England, especially, that we only really get democracy every 5 years.
Yeah.
When we get to elect a member of Parliament. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, definitely, especially because there's basically only a chance of either Labour or Conservative winning. Voters don't really get much of a choice in what they want. So even if you make the argument we only get democracy every 5 years, we don't even get full democracy. We get a choice between two people, and they will do what they want. So it is very poignant. It is a very big critique of the democratic system. We don't have full-time democracy. The changes are made by the people in power still. But, however, it is still a form of democracy. We choose the people, we vote the MPs in because they probably represent our views. So
I don't know, Tom, if you're familiar, or Jack, with the phrase, I think it's definitely England, is an elective aristocracy. The fact that the people ruling over us are just a very small amount of mainly rich old white men. So
Whether or not we want to say they're representative of the larger population as a whole, I think that's very much up to debate. Especially for the most part, and also when you look at something like an institution like the House of Lords, it's ridiculous, isn't it? At least I think the House of Lords seems very ridiculous on as the whole. It feels almost like the system's stacked against us. It feels like it's built to give us two options, both of which kind of meet in the middle when it comes to policy decisions a lot of the time. And that doesn't really seem like a healthy democracy, because the problem with just two options is extremists have to gravitate to one of those two options, which then obviously means the parties can become a bit more extreme. Or at least I think they give the illusion of being extreme, if you get what I mean. By which I mean the Democrats, if I want to shift this up to America really quickly, always seem to be on the edge in terms of extremity with someone like Bernie Sanders, but then he never gets in. Then we get Joe Biden, and then Joe Biden drone strikes Syria.
Yeah. I mean, I think calling Bernie Sanders an extremist is probably quite suited for America, but not the rest of the world.
Not compared to Scandinavia.
No. I think it's definitely true that the people in Parliament now, the vast majority of them don't really fit the actual people of the country. And also the House of Lords, I don't really get that at all. So the main premise of the House of Lords is that you give an award lordship as a reward, which is a really old type of doing things. And I remember reading somewhere that the PM is allowed to give as many lordships as they want, or peerages. Tony Blair gave something 300 in his premiership as Labour PM. The House of Lords is so big now; they need 3 houses to fit all the lords in.
It doesn't even feel like people understand democracy properly to an extent. Because I know, we're all aware when you vote, you choose your local MP. But a lot of the times it feels like people aren't really aware of that fact, and they genuinely think they're voting for the Prime Minister because it seems as though you are, but it feels like people aren't given enough information to be able to make informed decisions on things like this, especially in our election system. What do you think, Jack?
Going back to the House of Lords itself first, to play the devil's advocate, you could say the House of Lords was made up to try and establish some sort of a meritocracy, where the best and most successful people in the country were rewarded with some power. So there's always the reward of merit, but allowing them to change the rules, I think that's a bit too much to say that it's purely just a meritocracy, because at that point they could change the rules to benefit themselves, and that is not competitive. Also on the elective system, I think politics in most places have been corporatized or like gamified, where it's not about voting for who you believe in, it's about voting for a side that will win and then flying the colours of a side that will win. It's more of a red versus blue than a, oh, I believe this.
Tribalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we've already kind of delved into the problems in British politics, I thought that we could look at democracy from an ancient perspective
Yeah.
first, looking at the Plato and all that. So, the origin of the word democracy, I think it's always good to start anything with the etymology or something. Comes from demos, the people, and kratia. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's ancient Greek, the rule, so the power. So the power of the people. And then that's kind of formed now into democracy in the late 16th century. And then, so there've been loads of critics of democracy from the outset. I think Tom, do you want to name one of them? He's quite a big, famous guy in the old world of philosophy.
Which I wonder what in particular right now, which critic of democracy you're talking about right now, because there's quite a few massive ones.
Big shoulder man.
The big shoulder man. Could you possibly talking about Plato?
Why? By God. Yes, I am. If you don't know, Plato was the first. Well, I don't know if he's the first, but he's certainly one of the biggest criticizer of democracy. He hated the thing, and so did many other Greeks. They thought it was a really unproductive way of doing things, and they thought giving these people who had no experience in the political sphere the rights to vote for who will be leading the future of politics in their country, deciding these foreign relations, dealing with domestic policy, would be a stupid decision. And he used the analogy of a ship, and he said, if you're wanting to find a captain for the ship, who would you ask? Would you ask loads of random people in the pub on the dock? Would you say who should be the captain of this ship whilst they're drunk? Or would you ask the actual crew of the ship who have experience in being at seas? And everyone would argue, yes, you'd ask the crew, because why would you ask some people who have no experience with maritime? And then that's Plato applied that to society. I don't know what you guys think of that criticism.
I mean, it's a good criticism, you know. You would try and find a proper sailor, but I don't think it fully carries over to democracy, especially today, because the proverbial ship has to do with everyone all the time, and you know, we need to make sure that the sailor looks out for everyone, because it's not just a sailor. You don't just go from one position to the other. There's never a good decision. There's always trade-offs. So you need to make sure the captain fully represents everyone's views. So asking the higher classes, who are really detached from the struggles of the lower society, is a bad idea.
A lot of the time, that's really impractical, though, to go around to every single person, and it's physically impossible to kind of successfully represent 60 million people's views, or how many members of the franchise there are in the UK.
Yeah, and
I'd say it's a very hard task to do.
And that's the paradigm, the trade-off between true democracy and just asking the captain to pilot the boat.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I feel like the ship obviously makes a lot of sense, but I feel like a better way to describe it, personally, because when I look at the first of all, when I look at the ship analogy, it appears to be asking, should we let the people who don't get affected on the ship vote, or should we let the people who get affected by the ship vote? I feel like it'd probably be more apt to say, do we ask the cabin boy or the quartermaster, if you get what I mean? You know, on what level of the ship to do things. And in that respect, you probably could still make the case for the quartermaster or for the cabin boy, but at the same time, the quartermaster probably doesn't know the living conditions of the cabin boy, if you get what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking more, not technically, we're speaking quite metaphorical now, but I was thinking if we're gonna, I think Plato's point was, if you're gonna find someone to take the ship to India, you'd want to make sure that the people who choose the captain are trusting of the captain and not considering their own condition on the ship. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I can see that. I suppose
Also, go on, Tom.
All right. I suppose it matters a lot on Actually, Jack, just do yours. I'm just gonna cut this
You,
out.
you sure, Tom?
Yeah, I
All
can't
right.
remember what I was gonna say. It's too early.
And if I remember, Plato also had another big criticism of democracy, and that was the demagoguery of its figures, which would ultimately lead to more radical parties and populism, like as we could see in 1930s Germany, where these popular figures have become demagogues of the people. So I'm certainly seeing that around the world. It seems as if people vote for for their candidates based on their personality rather than their, ideas and their commitment to ideas. So, what do you guys think about that? Do you think demagoguery is growing in modern day democracy, and do you think that's
Yeah.
bad?
Um, well, that's the thing, isn't it? We need to first of all outline, is democracy bad? Should we stick with democracy? And I'm always drawn back to Winston Churchill's famous quote where he says, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others,"
Yeah.
which I think is quite apt. That we just have to stick with the one that we've got, democracy and pluralism, as people still get. It's not perfect by no
But it's
means, but I
better.
think it'd be very hard. Yeah, it's better than a authoritarian state.
Definitely.
But definitely risks to let's if we now establish that democracy and pluralism, which means the election of two parties, is fine. What are the risks within that? Well, the first risk, as Jack pointed out, is the rise of populism. If we talk Erdogan's Turkey and Modi's India
Yeah.
are two massive places where populism seems to be taking place. And especially nationalism is a massive new not new, but it's definitely a new wave in politics because a lot of these leaders use nationalism as an excuse to have quite ethno-religious backgrounds and then push out. It's as in India, for example, they're pushing out the states of Jammu and Kashmir, which are the only Muslim majority states in India, and they're getting rid of their democratic rights and they're militarizing the zones, and there's like been a mobile shutdown to these people, and they're using the excuse of nationalism and Hindu nationalism, especially in India, and the kind of dichotomy between Hinduism and Islam has been a massive issue in India for thousands of years, but it's really coming close now, and it feels like Modi in India is using the excuse of nationalism to portray these quite racist and prejudiced attitudes
Hmm.
towards Muslims, Islamophobia. And that's also happening in China with the concentration camps by President Xi Jinping. And yeah, I don't know what you guys think of that.
Yeah, on PM Modi, I believe he applauded. Oh, right. Context. Hindus believe, I think, or yeah, Indian Hindus believe cows are holy, so they don't eat them. They they want them to be free all the time. They have lots of like legislative rights in India. However, Muslims don't believe the same thing. So we're seeing this phenomenon where Muslims running like cow slaughterhouses, transporting cows, are being killed, beaten up by these roaming mobs of people who kill people who touch cows. And these guys are supported by the police, applauded by Modi, and it is fairly frightening, to imagine that gangs of people who are basically warring a religious and cultural war being applauded.
Yeah, especially by like, the powers that be. If like the establishment itself has already picked a side in a religious argument, which it really, really, really should never do, like in any circumstances. It's like, it's like indicative of like a failed state almost to see that that's like happening like currently in this day and age, that we're seeing like a culture war, and then we're seeing a quote unquote democratically elected party take a side in this. Like, I think if anything, that is really indicative of the fact that like we're seeing like problems of democracy through not just like say like populism and demagoguery inside of the leaders, but they seem to have very strong biased convictions, like Modi right here supporting one side instead of the other, when really he should be trying to hold an impartial side. But obviously, as we know, people are never impartial, or at least they're never entirely impartial. There's always some level of little bias inside of all of us that seems to sway us one way or the other, which gets to the point of no, I want to know how you guys feel about this. Currently, I could be wrong, but as far as I'm aware, like almost every country in the world has a leader who gets elected. What would you guys say about, apart from like I guess coalition governments, but how would you guys feel about like say like a system in which we have a joint partnership between like say like 2 or 3 leaders? So if one leader goes a bit too far, 2 more can push them back in line with majority vote. I don't know like how common this ever was in history. I know Jay, like you're like more avid on history than me. Are you aware of any times in history that this has ever been the case where we've had multiple leaders controlling a country at the same time?
Um, yeah, well, I guess you're thinking a bit of that's how, to some extent, working off committees, if that's what you mean. That's the kind of obviously you had in in the USSR you had the leader and the general secretary of the Communist Party and the
Yeah,
president. But then you also had committees to sort out certain bits of like welfare and stuff like
yeah,
that, and that worked relatively well. There's also two ways of electing officials that we haven't talked about yet, which is the 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 way that we use, which is first past the post, and so that's that whoever gets the most
yeah,
amount of
yeah,
votes wins the election. And then there's also the case which was used in 1919 before the Weimar Germany, before Nazi Germany. So this is proportional representation, and it's an electoral system in which a distribution of seats corresponds to the proportion of total votes. So, for example, if a party gained 40 of the total votes, a perfectly proportional system would allow them to gain 40% of the
yeah,
seats.
yeah,
So it's a lot more easy. The only problem with that, of course, is that if parties, it can be absolute anarchy, as shown in Weimar Germany, because so many people get elected. You got like 20, 20, 20, and 20, and there's no actual. They all kind of speak, and because there's no one who's got the total authority, they all kind of speak over each other, and it tends to be really there's it's really quite hard to form coalitions because they've all got
yeah,
so many different views. Jack, have you got something to add?
Yeah, harkening back to Tom's point of like perhaps 3 leaders, each representing a portion of the country, might be a better idea for democracy because they could like shoot down other leaders, perhaps more unpopular ideas. However, there is a situation where you could ultimately just end in deadlock because there is no guarantee that these sides will agree with each other or work with each other. So you run into the same problems where it's not fast. In fact, that would probably be even slower than the current democracy we have,
yeah, yeah.
and therefore would fail many times when a quick decision is needed.
Yeah, I suppose it depends. Like, obviously, like everything, these are all compromises. Do we want like possibly less extremism, but at the cost of like more bureaucracy inside of our government? It appears to be no matter what we look at, we're always looking at lots and lots and lots of trade-offs, depending on what it's possible to achieve, given our restraints and our limitations as like people as a whole. I'm sure you guys have seen that we've quote unquote seen a decline in democracy as of like late, especially with, like the coronavirus pandemic. And I'm sure you guys have looked at like democracy index, and you can see like what the global average score has overall hit like one of its all-time lows, and we see like the amount of like flawed democracies skyrocket along with France, which I'm sure Jack has a lot to say about that in particular. And also like if we look at the EU, I know this is very recent news, but how if I'm gonna quickly kind of curtail this a tiny bit in COVID direction, how we saw yesterday the European Union block the passage of 250,000 vaccines going to Australia. That seems, to me at least, very much veering on the side of a flawed democracy when it comes to being able to do something like that so soon. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean the EU for a trading bloc seems to try and be consolidating a lot of power. Especially since they're undemocratically elected. I don't think that's moral or democratic. If the EU wants to leverage this kind of power, they should be elected. So, continuing from the previous point, does democracy in the future even need to be people? As we know, with the rapidly advancing field of AI, could it be possible in the future where we could have a democratic system fully run by AI, at which then we skip the point of this bureaucratic delay because computers could do it like that? Would that be, looking to the future, a better system of democracy? And more importantly, would it be acceptable to have a computer running the country?
Sorry, I don't understand.
Yeah.
So people vote into a computer, do they?
So people vote for a personality or a thought chain through a computer. That computer takes like a bias towards popular opinion, and then through processes of a argument inside the computer, the democratic process is sped up through the use of a computer, especially looking forward into the future with the, again, rapidly advancing field of computation and AI.
Right, so in this, I'm not going to call it Orwellian because I know you get angry when anyone refers
Oh,
to
it's literally
anything
1984!
yeah. But in this dystopian world where all the people ruling the globe are robots, which I don't think is ever going to happen, would all the other countries be run by robots then?
Well, I mean, it would be up to the countries to choose if they wanted to be run by a robot, and if they are run by a robot, what kind of policies it biases towards.
Tom, do you have any pressing views on this?
I mean, it appears to be like, it's a kind of like high concept. Like, would it be more efficient than us? Would it be able to see things we can't? What systems would a computer come to think of on its own? Like, what if, like, say we created an AI and we said this is the most logical, forward-thinking thing we could imagine, and then it went to like classical utilitarianism? People would be kind of upset if that was the first model rule it went to.
Just for anyone who doesn't know, what actually no, classical utilitarianism. Tom, do you want to explain that to the viewers if anyone doesn't know?
We're looking at the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people when we look at that, and unlike rule utilitarianism, it's like always a case-by-case basis based on that, as opposed to rule, which is when we have set rules in place for certain situations, and apart from that, we follow greatest number for greatest amount. So, for example, under rule utilitarianism, we wouldn't permit stealing because, as a general rule, don't steal, it's bad. But under classical utilitarianism, if you were stealing to save some poor children who were starving, you would.
So yeah.
Well, I guess it'd be strange if there's a danger that it might just turn to like fascist, something like that. But I think, let's be honest here, I don't think we're going to be having robots rule us soon anytime soon. But what is very interesting is the growing hold corporations and conglomerates are holding over government. So I think a perfect example is the Trump ban on Twitter.
Yeah.
This was debated for a long time with free speech experts, free speech opinionists, saying that it was really unfair. And I think it's right that it highlights the massive power Twitter has to completely take someone's voice away. And it goes to show how much damage they can do in elections, not only to the people, but also through advertisement and kind of personalised messages that Twitter can and Facebook and these companies can do. Social media, especially. What can they do to government? And this has been, even if we don't consider social media, if we look at massive corporations and the funds they've been given to governments in the UK, for example, the BBC chairman donated £500,000 to the Conservative Party. So we can't really take these corporations to be unbiased.
Definitely.
If they've been doing things like that.
They seem to be biased, if anything, towards what can make them the most money, like the quickest amount of time, and like disregarding almost anything else. Please your shareholders, get those dividends in, and that seems to be kind of where we're at for companies and their goals. Obviously, there's outliers who seem to have moral messages, and they seem to be like non-profit organizations, so on and so forth. But when you look at lots of companies, and obviously they want to make money as quickly as possible, and with government legislations getting in the way, well, then they're more than happy to somehow sway public opinion or sway what government legislation is doing right now in order to make what they want to do just a tiny bit easier. And that's obviously why the minimum wage is so low in developing countries, or one of the reasons, because they're trying to attract these large companies towards them. If that minimum wage went up, they'd lose that, but that also means that their GDP per capita is abysmal. It's not just that factor affecting them, but that's one of like the many factors. If we want to pull this back to Twitter again, like you were saying before, Jay, we obviously Donald Trump getting banned. That removes, like, in a way, that removes his voice. Because right now, the soapbox of our age is the internet. It's social media. That's where people go to converse and to display public opinions. Whether or not they converse well on social media, we can definitely call into question. But it is true that right now that appears to be where the public discourse is happening. What do you think, Jack?
I mean, yeah, definitely. It could be argued that Twitter is a public space, especially now. You can definitely be prosecuted from things you do on Twitter, like it is a public space. But yeah, definitely, it is fairly wrong what Twitter's doing. However, it's a grey zone because they are still a private company.
Yeah.
So you have this like dichotomy of it is a public space, but it's a private company. That's like saying if a private company owned a park, would they be able to enforce their version of free speech or their speech rules on you? Also, linking back to the influence companies like Twitter and Facebook have on elections, I remember there was a whistleblower campaign called Project Veritas, where it was confirmed that these companies were taking money from political parties to silence oppositional views. And that is extremely wrong. That is bordering on fraudulent and tampering with any election. So, Jay, do you have any points on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very scary, isn't it, that these companies and these businesses are taking over. But we must also remember that there's always been a lot of donations between companies, and we wish, this is a case of democracy, we always wish that, the problem with democracy is it's always, they say it's not, but it's open to corruption. And you can really see that through these donations back and forwards between these multinational companies, between among like leaders of parties giving donations, and that really opens up to corruption. We think of the Hancock scandals that we've discussed last week, and that's one of the many things that have just come out into the public sphere and that have been hidden, arguably, for quite a long time, because this happened in like August and it's only come out now in March. So that's very interesting. It's a really dangerous point, because we need to think, we can complain a lot about our democracy, but we must think about the democracy in the cases of like sub-Saharan Africa, where they're really it's absolute anarchy over there, and Israel with Benjamin Netanyahu, the right-wing prime minister, who is silencing a lot of Palestine protesters. I don't want to start a conversation about Israel and Palestine on YouTube.
No.
I just mention it and move on.
Yeah.
But I think it's and then Erdogan's Turkey as well. He's got quite a lot of nationalistic tendencies. It's a really tricky one. I mean, we can sit here, as I say, and complain about our democracy, but I think we need to consider what else is happening in the world, especially in these countries that we hope to be the greatest economy in the world, in China. That's got a massive problem with democracy. We can't say just because the country's got money, the democracy is perfectly fine, because that's not the case at all.
Referring to the global state of democracy, we have seen on the Freedom House Democracy Index, that states that 75% of all the people in the world have lived in countries with declining democracies, and this is the 15th year in a row where there has been a net decline in democracy. By their index this year, it was minus 42%. Some of the biggest losses were Hungary, Hungary. I think Belarus also fraudulent elections, and also a big one, France. The Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index has stated France as a flawed democracy. Now, this is, wait, what? It's France. It's a birthplace of freedom, liberty, but, a lot of stuff has been going on. If you haven't been listening to the news, there's been pretty much monthly riots. Macron is very unpopular, with a 20% disagree in his popularity vote. Also, he has some very kind of almost hardline authoritarian policies, especially the ones he's proposed but have been protested against. He seems to be taking a very control-based approach to consolidating his power and consolidating his country, and this has ultimately led to them becoming a flawed democracy in the eyes of the Economist Intelligence Unit.
Yeah. It's
So,
not like
go on, Tom.
sorry. Okay, put this. You know what I mean. But yeah. Especially when we look at like it's not just France. We also have Portugal this year as well. So that's two mainline European countries just gone in an instant. And when I say gone, obviously they're still democratic, but flawed democracy, obviously indicative of what's happened to them from the state they used to be in. And when you look at the amount of full democracies you've got left, it's very, very, very small. We're looking at 23 countries, 8.4% of the world's population, with like the highest percentage of people being in flawed democracies, then followed by authoritarian regimes at 35%. Again, according to the same source Jack's using. So this very much like seems indicative of a fallen democracy, and we can blame this to we can pin this on quite a few factors. One of them obviously being coronavirus. That's obviously meant people's rights have been curb stomped. Jay, what do you think?
Coronavirus, yes, very interesting indeed. Many governments all over the world have kind of withheld or distorted crucial information about lockdown rule about the virus. They've imposed excessive or rather abusive lockdown rules, and use the virus as an excuse to consolidate power and suppress dissent. Right, so let's pick a country. Hungary. The Prime Minister of Hungary, Orbán, exploited the pandemic to amass emergency powers and to stir independent reporting and criticism. The Philippines, the administration of President Duterte employed a false ban on spreading false information to punish online criticism of its pandemic response. It seems to me that governments are using the COVID pandemic as an excuse to get rid of any opposition and suppress voters in their country nationally. El Salvador, the government used police and military troops to enforce a harsh lockdown. I mean, imagine if we saw that in England, and if you went to Sainsbury's and you got the British Army charging through, it'd be it'd be very strange. I don't know what your views are on that anymore.
That'd be shit, to be honest. But I wouldn't be surprised if some people defended it, because I feel like there's a growing sentiment of we need control and normalcy by any means. Now that's very dangerous. So that's populism to me. But again, it's bad. We shouldn't need the army on the streets. If we need the army on the streets to enforce a particular law, then there's probably something wrong with the law itself, rather than the people not following it.
Yeah, I think that rings true. Especially like it's almost like this like turned into like kind of like autocratic nanny states, and I'm gonna say it, Jack, and I know this might upset you. Kind of Orwellian, obviously not particularly, but at the same time, it's kind of interesting to see this downward turn and shift into different forms of democracy, especially ones where we seem to be losing liberty, because it seems like the debate surrounding liberty and what our rights are as people seems to be shifting. Because obviously, like I've seen a much larger sentiment rising in the whole phrase, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, and that's always been a very awful phrase in my mind, because it seems to circumvent people's like rights on a base like level, and it also seems very susceptible to corruption if you have a police force or any kind of government force that is very much willing to bend the rules in their favour. I know we talked earlier about corruption is a problem of democracy, but personally, it's a problem of people as a whole, and that any system of people have their own ways they want to move in life. People have their own like goals, and to make their way towards these goals, they're willing to do a lot of things that they probably shouldn't do. If I want to take this back a few years now, and we have a look at Edward Snowden, whistleblower, obviously looked at how the American people were being spied on, like quite severely by their government. He releases his information. What happens? He's stuck living in Russia now, and he's he's a convicted criminal as far as the USA is concerned. And if he goes back there, he'll get a conviction based on no jury and just on whether or not he broke the laws or not. And that's obviously, in my opinion, that's quite frightening. That can happen to someone just for a whistleblowing problem to them his own country, he can get branded a traitor. We're yet to see a president like say they pardon him, which I find very, very disgusting. That's the kind of situation we're living in now. And obviously, that's years. We're talking years ago with that in particular. So, if we're looking at democracy declining, have we been in a slow decline in this period of peace that we've been living in? Through the 2000s, or at least in Europe and Western countries. Obviously, there has been little peace as far as the Middle East and Asia goes. Jack.
So Tom, I'm gonna counter your point by saying I am classic American guy. I like America. I have an American flag on all my clothes.
Except for the fact that you know America.
No,
Sorry, is this hypothetical?
Yeah.
Right.
Hypothetically, and I say to you, we do what we do. We torture terrorists. We prosecute people who leak national secrets because these undermine the authority of our country and reduce the greater good we can do.
Give me a second. I'm going to think of a response.
Can I pop in now while
Yeah,
Tom's
sure.
thinking of a response? Right. So this kind of before 20th century, 1800s, America was relatively free, apart from slavery. But for the white people, it was perfectly free. And then the war came, and then the Soviet Union was formed in 1923 after the Russian Revolution. It was slowly getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Then a man called McCarthy wanted to kind of profit off this, and he called it the Red Scare. And he said to all the Americans, these communists, they're going to turn your kids gay, because gay was a terrible thing back then. They said they're gonna rape your wives. It's terrible. These communists, they're horrible people. And then everyone in America, rightly, got terrified. And McCarthy played off this and what he said, and he started to take people in, these movie stars, and they started to take them in, and they started to give them trials without juries, and they put cameras all over people's houses. They booked people's houses. They booked people's cars. They stormed into people's houses, and if they found a copy of the Communist Manifesto in the bookshelf, they would take them away to prison without sentence. And it all of a sudden seems like, because there is a competitive authoritarian state on the other side of the world in Russia at that time, and probably still to this day, but at that time it seems like America thought, oh well, we ought to get a bit totalitarian with our policy, and that's what they did. And it was really obviously it ended later on when McCarthy stood in. He tried to interview these American troops in the army, and everyone got a bit annoyed that he shouldn't be interviewing troops to see if they're communist. But it feels like America, the land of the free, all of a sudden in the 50s turned and became the land of the suppressed, because they were too worried about, and they were too influenced arguably by the totalitarian authoritative state overseas in the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
it's very interesting to see what a neighbouring country can play on your own policy.
Yeah, or really like any external force, because obviously like draconic measures come in to like police the coronavirus in much like a similar way. We look at an external threat, an external force, and our response is to panic and it's to curb people's liberties. If I can quickly like go back to Jack's classic American, I'd ask him why is it that his state's authority shouldn't be undermined? Why is it that his state's authority should be kept so high? And why is it that we should then look towards the state as this moral arbiter? And why the state as a whole should be like seen as like this infallible being? Because it's only through like understanding the fallibility of the state that we can call it into account, into question. Because every time that you are willing to undermine people to protect the state, you're willing to undermine yourself, and you're willing to undermine the rights that protect you as well as everyone else. And I think that on the whole is a very, very bad thing to do. What do you think, Jack? How would you going to tell me a classical American would counter?
I want to move away from classical American to more like a classical nationalist, or or someone who just is patriotic about their country. Because I feel like focusing on American is being a bit, mean to them when this happens elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world. But they would probably say, because our system of leadership is the best, we can do a lot of good in the world if our state had the authority to do so.
I'd probably wonder why is it that why they think that system's the best in the world, and whether or not they have statistics to back that up. Again, I know you said not to bring up America, but at the same time, when you have a look at like rankings in terms of healthcare and education and literacy rates and homelessness, then it kind of runs contrary to that. And again, I'd ask any nationalist whether or not they believe in the motto "nothing to hide, nothing to fear," or at least any nationalist who's willing to defend his country even when it's clearly in the wrong, just for like some sense of imaginary national integrity, which doesn't seem to equate to anything. Jay, have you got a point?
Because that phrase "nothing to hide, nothing to fear," that does sound quite very dystopian.
Definitely.
And very Soviet Union-esque. Kind of, we've moved away quite far now from democracy to discussing the idea of freedom, which I guess
they link
is a democratic privilege that comes with democracy. But if we could move back now, if I may, because we've only going to be ending soon.
Yeah.
If we could talk about England.
Right.
So England, I'm not too keen on how I'm using the Freedom House data, which is a think tank set up in America, a massive think tank dedicated to talking about democracy. And I'm not quite sure, it feels a bit trivial how they give people points and they give them colours and scores. Like, you got 93 out of 100 for democracy. Good job. Well, that's what Britain got. They got 93 out of 100. And one of the main points it got was, "Are safeguards against official corruption strong and effective?" Which is very interesting. And of course they aren't, because the £22 billion worth of contracts was brought up. And also the £840,000 Dominic Cummings received to do the Brexit related focus group. So that's really interesting how they'd class England as quite a corrupt state.
Yeah,
don't know what you guys
I suppose it's in proportion to the other countries around it, or at least it's in part, like, in comparison to the kind of corruption we see in other places. Because, like, maybe from that lens, you could see the UK's are doing a much better job at policing this corruption. Even if, like, from our perspective, we see it and we think, "Oh, this is awful." I bet in comparison to, like, say, if we looked at Venezuela, if you want a really extreme example, we probably think, this seems much better. Jack, what do you think?
Yeah, to kind of critique our sources a bit, there was a Italian person in the comments of, I think, the Freedom House, either the Freedom House or the Economist Democracy Index, and they were saying, why has their country, Italy, not been moved down in an index ranking? With all that's happened in our country, he believes it's got far more corrupt and less democratic. And then he made a point of the northern Scandinavian countries. They fought to protect people's liberties, trying to make lockdowns as least harsh as possible, but they still got moved down, more so than Italy, which he believes was a massively corrupt state. So these sources should be taken with a grain of salt.
Of course.
They can't take opinions from everyone, and there's some stuff which is not de facto. Corruption is corruption, and it's hidden. If corruption wasn't hidden, it wouldn't be as big of a problem. So
yes.
We can't definitively say or measure how corrupt a country is.
Yeah, and from there, can we definitively have a look at how democratic a country is either? Because, obviously, if there is any underworkings going on, any Machiavellian schemes to keep us all, like, in line, we wouldn't know. That's the point. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I think it's very tricky, isn't it, corruption? Because, funnily enough, Italy's got the same corruption rate as the United Kingdom, which feels strange within itself, and we don't know what they're hiding, and we don't know how they report on corruption in these states. If we could just talk about democracy, do we think there is any alternative to the democratic state we are living in right now in the UK? And do you think there's any other forms of government that could do a better job? Tom?
By God, if I had one, I'd campaign for it. I'm afraid, like Winston Churchill said, I can't think currently of a better system than the one we're in. Maybe tweaks to democracy, maybe like proportional representation in voting, or not exactly that, but there's I can't remember the exact term. There's one where it's like you take preferred candidates on a list of your most preferred to least preferred, which means even if your first choice doesn't go in, like your second most your votes go to your second most preferred candidate, which stops tactical voting, because all of a sudden it means people are voting for the people they want, and then the people they think will win second, which obviously stops tactical voting, which may help with partisanship and pluralism.
Preferential ballot.
Yeah,
Preferential
that's the one.
voting,
Thanks. That'd be like the only fix I could think of, because I feel like anything that can change people's voting habits, or at least make them more true to what they believe, could be really helpful. What about you, Jack?
Yeah, and our last point today is from Jack. What do you think of our democracy at the moment, Jack?
I mean, to conclude, it is the best thing. We are afforded tons of freedoms today, tons of freedoms to move upwards. If you wanted a critique of the neoliberal state we're in, you could read Gilles Deleuze, Marx. There's tons of guys against it, but democracy is really good. We are afforded many freedoms, and I like that. And I can't see anything else that's better.
Wonderful. Okay, that's the end of the podcast. Please remember to like and subscribe, and soon we'll be as big as Mr. Beast. Please also check out the website for new articles coming up. I think Jack's got one on the budget coming up sometime soon. That will be the end of the podcast. Thank you very much.